This is a Spyderco Delica, which is one of the flagship models of Spyderco knives. Has been around for a very long time, around with the Endura, which is its bigger brother. This has the wave opening, popularized by Emerson. This is a saber ground model, partial height grind. Many different incarnations of these knives are also made in flat grind. This is a version in ZDP-189, which is a powdered metallurgy steel, very high chromium carbide content, and very high hardness. Now, while I normally use this knife for harder work, because since it has the saber grind, it's much more geared towards durability, and I left the edge angle and the edge thickness at the stock profile again because it's more of a knife that I use for durability rather than raw cutting ability. But since ZDP-189 is much harder, with a much higher wear resistance, I wanted to put a much finer edge on it so it would do more precise cutting tasks. So what I did was I simply flattened the edge bevel. So you can see now it's a single grind. Very similar to what you would find on your standard Mora knives and your Pucos, which just have one single edge bevel. And they're usually, again, saber grind partial height. Simply because if you made them full height, the final angle, of course, would be extremely small and most likely be durability issues. So this is around 10 degrees per side, and if it was a full height grind, it would be around 5 degrees per side. So you can see that this bevel is actually much higher than the bevel on the Mora. Look at two of them, significantly higher. And you can see the bevel on the Delica is almost a full blade width of the Mora through the middle. Which means, of course, you would expect the angle on this to be about half the angle that's on the Mora because they're of similar stock thickness, and it is. Now this cuts very well, significantly improved over the stock grind, which again looked very similar to this. The problem is, though, as with maintaining any single bevel grind, when you want to sharpen it, you have to plane down this entire bevel. Now, because Moras, and most of the Puco style knives, are of very simple steels, they're very easy to grind. So you can scrub down this primary bevel very easy because the grindability is very high because the carbide load in the steel is very low. So it's very easy to grind because all you're doing is grinding actual steel, not carbide, and carbide is much harder than the steel itself. But this is one of the highest carbide stainless steels made. It's comparable to, say, S90V in terms of wear resistance and therefore grindability. So I didn't want to leave it like this because, again, that means anytime I have to sharpen this, I have to plane down this great big wide bevel, which takes some time. But I also didn't want to just add an apex bevel to this because the apex bevel would thicken over time very quickly because this is a relatively short grind compared to the height of the blade. And I'd end up with the edge thickening and it moving back towards being more durability. And I wanted to give this a primary grind profile which has a very high maintenance. This is like this. Now this is the Spyderco Temperance 2. You can see it has a full height flat primary grind and a small apex bevel. And because the primary grind is full height, you can sharpen this apex bevel many times and it doesn't thicken. Because again, the higher the primary grind, the slower the edge bevel thickens with repeated sharpenings. So to make your knife very low from the point of term of long-term maintenance, put a high primary grind on it, and then you need to do very little work besides sharpening the apex bevel. So what I did was I put a full height flat grind on the other side of the Delica, and I left a very small amount of the edge at the original grind angle, which is right here. Now I could take this primary grind straight down to the edge. The problem is that would leave the edge extremely fine in regards to the angle. The edge angle will be between 2 and 3 degrees per side, which is very fine. That's even below what a straight razor is. In fact, the angle right here is between 5 and 6 degrees per side, which again is approaching the angle of the straight razor. And I usually run this with a small micro bevel, which is a true micro bevel, which means it's ground on and then back sharpened to almost remove it. But what this does, adding the full height primary grind, is two things. Number one, ease of sharpening is very, very high, because of course all I'm grinding is this very fine secondary or apex bevel, which sharpens very fast. And the other thing is maintenance is excellent, because I don't need to do anything besides just sharpening this secondary or apex bevel. Because it has a full height grind, even with repeated sharpenings, the edge bevel thickens very, 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 very slowly. So basically all that will happen is this will thicken very slowly, and after many, 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 many sharpenings, the edge will gradually thicken, and then I'll plane down the primary bevel again using power equipment. But again, the main benefit is intermittent sharpening, keeping the edge sharp, is very, very high, and periodic maintenance, which you need to do on the primary grind, is very infrequent. To be specific, the maintenance required, or the rate of thickening of the secondary or apex bevel, is directly proportional to the height or angle of the bevel. So the secondary bevel on this knife will thicken twice as fast as a secondary bevel on this knife. So not only do I get better cutting ability, better control of the knife, ease of sharpening, I also know that the fact that the edge is going to stay stable at that thickness for twice as long as it will on this knife. So that's many benefits of doing a high primary grind. It gives you a secondary bevel which cuts well, is in general more durable, has better control, sharpens much easier, and requires much less long-term maintenance. So of course all I have to do now is put the full primary grind on this side. Now this is actually left with a 36 grit belt finish, which is really rough. You wouldn't want to leave it at this finish even if you didn't care about aesthetics, because this finish is actually difficult to actually clean. Now if you get this knife dirty and you try to wipe it down with like paper towel or tissue, it actually sticks into these grooves. You can actually hear my nail catching in them. They're very, very high. So normally what happens is the first time I sharpen this, after I get it to the right shape as it is now, I'll just scrub this a bit with 1000 grit stone to just bring the scratches down. And normally every time I sharpen it for a few times after that, I just scrub it a little bit. Of course you can just use finer grits on the belt sander to actually do that. The only concern is you get heat buildup much faster as the grits get much higher, so you want to watch doing something like that. Because again, when you get steels like this, powder metallurgy steels, you're buying a very, very high performance product, and especially with Spyderco, for example, has taken the time to get a very high hardness on this. You don't want to run the blade that hot that you end up throwing away a few points of hardness on the edge and then damage it with micro cracking and a bunch of other things, because why would you spend all the time to buy such a high grade steel and then damage it like that? So I will, like I said, just leave this with a 36 grit belt finish, and then I'll just hand buff it down a little bit intermediately, and after sharpening it 3 or 4 times, this will be roughly a 1000 grit finish. And again, you can do this in one setting. You can just sit down with, say, 100 grit stone, scrub it for about 30 seconds, 400 grit stone, scrub it for about 30 seconds, work your way up, and spend about 3 to 4 minutes, and this will have a very hazy 1000 grit finish. But again, I'm not much into polishing, so I'll normally just clean this up on the stones when it actually gets dirty. But very nice knife. You can see I've carried this for quite some time. Clip is showing a lot of wear. Really like this knife. This is a relatively nice steel. The only downside, as with most of the high carbide stainless steel, this isn't what most people would consider to be a true stainless steel, which means that it will spot relatively easy. Like if you were using this in the kitchen and you left it wet or left it with any kind of vinegar or acid or on it for any length of time, you are likely to see spotting on it. But that is relatively common with any of the high carbide stainless steels.